Hi, my name is Amy.
And my name is James.
And this is How I Learned to Love Shrimp, a podcast about promising ways to help animals and build the animal advocacy movement.
Today, we're joined by Eva Hamer from Pax Fauna, and we spoke about Eva's experience in grassroots activism, their narrative research conducted by Pax Fauna, as well as their upcoming ballot initiatives in Colorado. Please do let us know what you think of the episode and share it with all friends and family and anyone who'll be interested. Thanks for listening.
We're joined today by Eva Hamer. Eva is co-founder and operations lead of Pax Fauna, a non-profit that seeks to revitalize the grassroots animal advocacy movement through conducting original research on messaging, strategy, and culture. We're really excited to welcome Eva and to chat through the work of Pax Fauna. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to speak with you both.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Eva. We like to start everyone off with the same question, which is basically, if you as an individual somehow received $50,000, how would you spend this effectively to help animals? And why would you do that?
It's an easy question because it's something we're actively trying to do at Pax Fauna. One thing that I think would be really amazing is to have some real research happening alongside an upcoming ballot initiative so that we can really know what the effect of that ballot initiative is. So some of the ways that the $50,000 could go to just getting the movement, the kind of information that we need to be able to do our work effectively, could be like doing public opinion polling before and after a ballot initiative, asking a population of U.S. residents, in our case, questions about their support for animal freedom in a jurisdiction where we're going to run a ballot initiative. Do that same thing before and after to get some good information about what the effect is that we actually had.
Yeah, amazing. Is there a particular ballot initiative, that you were referring to, something that's coming up?
Yeah, there are two that I'm really interested in. One is kind of coming out of Pax Fauna itself, hoping to run a ballot initiative in Denver, Colorado in 2024, which is just now getting started. Another one is IP3 in Oregon. A different group is running that one, but that one's very radical, and it'll be really interesting to see what the effect is that it has.
What's that ask?
In Oregon, it's to ban killing and breeding animals in the entire state of Oregon. Unlikely that kind of thing would pass, and the idea
Nothing
of
major.
putting it on the ballot and having the conversations about it, having some media around it, would be really, really interesting to see what the actual effect is.
Yeah, right. We just spoke to Silvano Liga from Sentience in Switzerland, who just ran the factory farming initiative last year. And yeah, it's so interesting. I feel like I'm a real advocate now for pushing and starting that conversation. I find it really fascinating how, and yeah, exactly, like public opinion polling and just seeing if anything shifted between their opinion before and after a ballot initiative like that.
Yeah, and ballot initiatives themselves are so cool. Obviously not something that most of the world has access to. But in the US, about half the states can run ballot initiatives. Citizens put laws directly in front of the people to vote on. And I think that that's a really underutilized tactic to start some of these conversations, for sure.
Maybe zooming out a little bit, then is that one of the core kind of like goals of Pax Fauna? And maybe you want to speak a bit about Pax Fauna and what you guys do, but is it to kind of utilize this, what you think is like a neglected or underused tactic within the US animal advocacy movement, is to kind of implement or try out ballot initiatives of varying asks in various states? Is that broadly right?
Yeah, that's definitely a big part of the strategy. We think about our existence as there to reverse the cultural norm of eating animals, where a lot of groups are working on other pieces of the puzzle. We talk about like the taste and price and convenience of animal-free foods. We think that there's kind of a missing piece to that equation, all of those pieces being really important. But one missing piece to that, we think, is culture. And we see ourselves as kind of living in the culture space. And so when we think about ballot initiatives, we think about an intervention kind of directly on the culture, something where we can implement some of the messages that we've tested through research to try to get conversations happening that get people to think about animal agriculture in a different way, instead of relating to it as something that just kind of happens between my house and the grocery store. We want to think about it as something that happens on a system-wide level, and that we're thinking of ourselves as, civic actors, as citizens, and not just as consumers.
Do you think of these ballot initiatives as not necessarily tools just to pass policies, but it seems like it's tools to start conversations? So you think they're useful in of themselves, not just to actually pass laws. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for clarifying that. I see them going really hand in hand. I'm interested both in the actual policy impact of a ballot initiative? What's the actual change that happens because of it? And equally, if not slightly more interested in what are the conversations? What's the cultural effect? Like, what does it mean to the people that this was on the ballot? And what does it mean to the people that this won, if it is able to win?
Just to contextualize, what kind of, is it like signature collection? How do you get to a point of proposing a ballot and something that the people of the state have to vote upon?
Yeah, and that's another really cool part of ballot initiatives. It's going to take a whole lot of volunteer mobilization and movement building, really, capacity building to get something on the ballot. So the process is, it's different timing-wise in the state. The reason that Oregon is able to do this really, really radical one is that they have basically 2 years to gather signatures. In the city of Denver, we're going to have about 6 months, I believe. So you submit something to the government. They kind of approve the language. Then you have some time to gather signatures. Those signatures have to be submitted and approved. Usually a good portion of them get thrown out because maybe the person's not registered to vote in the area, or they moved since they signed, or something like this. Once you kind of hit that threshold and you've hit it by a deadline, then your language gets to be put on the ballot at the next election.
Very nice.
And in terms of the capacity building side of things, or it seems like, I think so, you used to be fairly involved with direct action everywhere. And would you say your work at Pax Fauna is like somewhat influenced by that? Or would you like inspired by that? Yeah, what's the relationship between like that previous work and what you're doing now?
I think of myself as kind of an alum of direct action everywhere. It definitely is kind of where I cut my teeth in the movement. It's what shaped a lot of the ways that I think about the movement. The thing that's really special about direct action everywhere is this real interest in mass mobilization. And they also kind of have this same idea about the consumer frame. They came into existence understanding that the movement has been asking people to go vegan as like their primary ask for ever. And that's not working, that it brings up defensiveness. It brings up kind of a small-minded sort of thinking about the problems. And what we kind of uncovered in our research is that it brings up futility. It brings up this idea that like, there's nothing I can do as an individual person. Like, no matter how big you tell me this problem is, no matter how awful you tell me that the meat industry is, if I think about myself as an individual person in relationship to it, there's nothing I can do. And DXC kind of had an understanding of the problem with kind of what we call the consumer frame from day one. They also, I think, something we inherited from them is a risk tolerance, a sense that we want to try big things and sometimes they're going to fail. And, you want to be tolerant enough of risk that sometimes things are going to go wrong. And that's something that we accept. Yeah, we carry definitely a lot of influence from DXC and have really enormous respect for the work that they're continuing to do.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, I think on the risk tolerance side, I think if all your campaigns were succeeding, that probably means you're way not ambitious enough. So it definitely makes sense. Like at least some things shouldn't work out. So yeah, I think that seems like a very reasonable approach. And then maybe just for people who may not know about DXC, what's like a flavor of some stuff that DXC or Direct Action Everywhere would do? So what kind of group are they? What's some examples of stuff either they do or you've done with them? And yeah, maybe any consequences of that.
So the thing that they're known for the most is their early restaurant disruptions, where we would go into a restaurant or a grocery store and we would get everyone's attention and we would give a little speech and then we'd chant for a minute and then we'd leave.
What would you chant?
We would chant, "It's not food, it's violence," with whatever it was that we would chant. It's kind of what DXC was probably infamous for the most. They don't do so much of that anymore. I think that was really important for a lot of the people in terms of just the transformation that it gave people, this kind of sense of just really breaking social norms and like still being okay afterwards. A lot of people came to identify with the movement very strongly after their participation in these disruptions. Another thing that DXC is known for is open rescue. Especially lately, they've been getting a lot of attention, rightly, for some trials associated with open rescue. So this past fall, a couple of their organizers, Wayne Shung and Paul Darwin Picklesheimer, were on trial for rescuing a couple of pigs from a Smithfield farm. They were acquitted unanimously by a jury, which was just an amazing victory, like many years in the making. Mm. And then the same thing happened with Alicia Santurio and Alexandra Paul just got acquitted for rescuing some chickens. And then this coming fall, I myself will be on trial for the rescue of some dogs from a testing and breeding facility in Wisconsin. So we kind of have our fingers crossed for another surprising victory on
Yeah, fingers crossed indeed. Yeah. And there's how many of you on trial, and like what kind of like charges are you facing, or like what kind of sentencing are you facing in like a worst case or like expected scenario?
I am charged alongside Wayne Xiang and Paul Darwin Picklesheimer, and we are facing felony burglary and theft for the rescue. Off the top of my head, I think that it's 9 years prison for a worst case scenario. Who knows what the actual outcome would be if we were found guilty. They would call me like a first time offender or something. It would be my first only conviction. For Wayne, it would not be his first. So it's difficult to say what the kind of expected outcome would be, but there's definitely a big part of me that expects an acquittal if we were to go to trial. I mean, these are dogs, it's man's best friend. The conditions inside the facility were pretty horrific. Most people have had relationships with dogs, as opposed to these other trials where anybody who was vegan was like, I don't even think anybody vegan was in the jury pool, but they would have been thrown out immediately for being too biased. Whereas we can't throw people out. The prosecution won't have access to be able to throw people out if they have had a close relationship with a dog, because that's basically everyone. So I think that in that way we'll kind of have a big advantage.
And is there crossover between these previous convictions across different states?
Yeah, the different acquittals were in different states. So the pig one was in Utah, and the chickens just now were in California, and this one will be in Wisconsin. So yeah, very different states, very different cultures. It'll be different in a whole lot of ways. So I'm not overconfident that the same kind of cultural forces will be at work, and definitely very hopeful that it'll be hard to kind of send somebody to prison for rescuing dogs who were suffering.
Yeah, of course. It's interesting, I guess, that hopefully those previous cases at least set some sort of precedent for this one. How do you feel as a member of the movement with that kind of looming? Is it affecting the work that you're doing now, or thinking of future actions like this that you might embark on later down the line?
Yeah, that's a great question. Seeing the acquittals of Wayne and Paul in Utah, and then Alicia and Alexandra in California, I definitely feel really hopeful for the future of open rescue. I think that it's a tactic that had some really good ideas behind it, but those ideas just didn't get tested for a really long time because the system moves so slow.
Yeah, the first trial was from 2017 rescue, right? So it took like over 5 years to get to actual trial. So yeah, huge delay in like knowing if these ideas will work with a jury or not.
Yeah, and mine also happened in was it 2016 or 2017 that the rescue actually happened, and then the charges didn't come down until last year. We didn't even know that we were going to get charged. Yeah, so it definitely it takes a very long time to test, and I'm feeling really hopeful about open rescue itself. Definitely things different about this trial that make it both better and worse than these past ones. And so how am I feeling about it? There's a part of me that's definitely scared, definitely doesn't want to go to prison, that wants to be able to keep doing the work that I'm doing free.
Very understandable.
Yeah. There's also a pretty significant part of me that's like really excited about it, that really wants to have this conversation, that's really proud of what Direct Action Everywhere did around the rescue.
And so Wayne's an attorney, I understand. So is he representing all three of you during the case?
He won't represent all three of us. Well, in Utah, he represented himself. So I'm represented by local counsel. And Paul is represented by, I believe, the Denver Law Clinic. So we kind of have a good range of expertise, both kind of on the local politics of the situation and the animal political side.
I find it interesting, again, as like a communication tactic. I feel like even just educating the jury or the attorneys that work for you, maybe they've not come across these types of issues. I actually feel like even in itself, the education of the trial and the people that have to sit and listen to all of the evidence and I guess educate themselves in that moment, it's activism in and of itself. So interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. What would it be like to be a member of the jury on one of these cases? I'm sure they come away with it thinking very differently about the industry.
Okay, so thinking about the broader kind of theory of change then for Pax Fauna, I know from the research that you just released, there's this sense of needing a real kind of credible path towards the future of not using animals and what that looks like. Maybe you could just explain a little bit about that end goal for Pax Fauna and what that looks like.
Pax Fauna has this like I said, like this goal of reversing the cultural norm of eating animals. And we want to find kind of best practices around the messaging of the movement and also the culture and the strategy of the movement, and test those in the real world, like really put something into practice that we can invite others to join, something that is backed by real strategy and messaging and in tactics, and has a really strong volunteer apparatus that can make good use of a lot of people's enthusiasm. I think that there are a lot of people out there right now who really, really want to get involved in the movement and just don't know what would be a good use of their time, and they're just kind of frozen about it. I just ran a study about U.S. animal organizers, a bunch of people who'd been involved in the animal rights movement in the U.S. for a long time, and they were a lot of them, I think, expressed the sense that the pandemic sort of lowered their involvement and gave them a chance to reflect. And then the thought of coming back is just kind of overwhelming, because there's a sense that I exhausted myself for all this time and am not really seeing the results that I wanted. And what we'd really like is to have a good idea to invite people to be involved in, and to have something that is actually a meaningful contribution that anyone can make, which in turn can kind of politicize the issue for the public, something that is an actual ask that we can have of the public. It's not go vegan. It's not something on the consumer side, but it gives you some kind of systemic ask of the public to support the movement.
Yeah, on the communication side of things, so maybe you can chat about this now, but you guys have done an impressive amount of kind of narrative research, which maybe you want to explore. But I guess the idea is to test this narrative research, like you said, kind of like in reality, right, in these ballot initiatives. Maybe you don't touch on the narrative project you guys have done over the last 18 months and how you did that, and maybe first that, and then we'll talk about the key findings.
As you mentioned, very big narrative project, took us 18 months. It started with, we did reviews of what was already out there. So we did a review of kind of the social movement literature around framing and narrative messaging. We also did a review of how the media was talking about the issues, also how advocates themselves and our opposition, like the kind of government checkoff programs or industry groups, how they were talking about the issues.
By the issues, do you mean like anything kind of related to animal rights or animal advocacy related policies, or like is there something specific you guys looked at?
Animals used for food is kind of our issue area. So how's the media talking about animals used for food? How are the opposition groups and advocates talking about that issue? And then we did a bunch of interviews, these kind of 30-minute open-ended interviews with Americans, kind of ordinary Americans, people who eat meat. A bunch of them talked to us on Zoom, and we asked a lot of open-ended questions, like what comes to mind when you think about animals used for food? After kind of getting this sense, that the purpose of the interviews was this sense of just wanting to map, like what's already going on. How are, in the same way that we sort of asked, how has the media, opposition advocates already talking about animals used for food? How's the ordinary public kind of usually thinking about this?
And how did you find these people?
We advertised kind of a paid survey, paid interview opportunity on different places where those kinds of things are advertised, like on Reddit and a little bit on Facebook. And so that's how we recruited for our interviews and also our focus groups. So because of that, it wasn't like a representative panel of the United States. Interviews leaned a little bit liberal, a little bit young. Then in the focus groups, we actually intentionally excluded conservatives. The reason we did that is that we think that our base kind of, it seems to mirror the demographics of the Democratic Party in the US. So people who are a little bit younger, a little bit more liberal, a little bit maybe more educated, more likely to live in cities, are people who are more likely to support animal rights. That doesn't mean that we don't have support among conservatives, but the support is just a little bit more concentrated among liberals.
By base, do you mean people who are like kind of level of like will join the movement and like will help like canvass and knock on doors and get people out, or is it more like they'll literally just vote yes, or like they'll be supportive of policies? Like what level of engagement do you consider when you're thinking of base?
Great question. I'm thinking of yes votes. I'm thinking of people who are just, they don't need any convincing. They're going to vote yes on any animal measure. And we wanted to think about like those people, what's going on in their heads, and what's the thing that's going to switch the people who are maybe a little bit more neutral to be that definite yes. And when they're on the yes side, how are they thinking about it? Like what's the language that they're using to explain why it makes sense to ban slaughterhouses, for example? We tested some of those messages in focus groups. And the reason that we switched to focus groups to do the message testing is that it raises the difficulty level so much when you have multiple people in a room. It's not just kind of when you're doing an individual interview with someone, it's amazing the kind of amount of support that they can get to without anybody else there to remind them what they usually believe or what the dominant narrative is.
Right.
If it's just you and me in a room and you're just kind of talking through your beliefs, like you can get to some really radical places. If you're in a room with 4 other ordinary Americans and you're hearing one of them say like, well, it's my personal choice, I can do whatever I want. And then that reminds you, oh yeah, I really care about personal choice. I don't want anyone to stop me from eating what I want to eat. So the focus groups really kind of up the difficulty level in that way by letting people remind each other what the dominant narrative frames are.
This is much more realistic, right? Because it's like, in reality, if you have a ballot initiative, you're saying one thing, the opposition is saying something else. So you want messages that like robust to being like the counter message of the animal ag lobby in this case, being like, no, actually, remember, these people are like lying to you, whatever things they want to say. So I guess, yeah, it definitely makes sense to actually test how good your messages resist other messages.
Exactly. Like that's how we actually form our beliefs in the real world, is with conversations with friends and family, seeing different conversations happening in the media. We aren't just kind of in a silent room talking it through, being asked open-ended questions. Though if we were, it seems like we would come to very different places.
So how many people did you interview? Like, how many focus groups did you do? Like, yeah, it was a sense of like how many people you spoke to. And this is like all around the US, or is this like in particular states?
All around the US, yeah. We limited it to voters. Yeah, around 200 Americans were involved in the kind of qualitative side, where we're actually talking to people. And then we ran a series and are continuing to run quantitative surveys, which involved, more like thousands of people. The message that we kind of came out of all of this with, we call Evolve Together, which had elements of talking about evolution, because evolution was the metaphor that people would use the most often if they were kind of getting through that base layer of futility that I mentioned earlier, that sense that like, there's nothing I can do about this issue if I'm just one person. If they could talk themselves through that, they tended to use this metaphor of evolution. They would say things like, well, society has evolved in big ways all the time. I mean, think about gay marriage, or think about cannabis. Like, we're really changing in big ways. And like, maybe this will be a way that we change also. That's the kind of thing that we would hear from participants. And so in a lot of these messages, we would take participant language. Like if one of these ordinary Americans that we talked to was able to talk themselves into supporting the issue, we would sometimes try to borrow that language and try that on other participants. And so that's where we got evolution metaphor. We'd also talk about all the different kind of pieces of the system to try to illustrate what a system frame would look like. That it's not just the consumer in the grocery store; it's also politicians and restaurants and grocery stores and food producers and manufacturers and farmers, all kind of the sense that they're all working together to phase meat out gradually, to really like paint a picture of it being a system-wide transition. That message we tested in surveys and found some support that it does like as well or better as the classic messages.
What are the classic messages? What do you mean by that?
So a lot of the ways that the movement talks about the issue right now is there's a lot of education going on. What we found is that participants tended to already know they already had like quite a bit of familiarity with the horrors of the industry. They already knew that meat was bad for the environment. What was interesting about some of the kind of educational messages that we tested is that participants seemed very, very sensitive to exaggeration. If we used, say, there's a range, we don't quite know what the exact proportion of greenhouse gas emissions is in the world from animal agriculture. If we use the lower end of that number, people found it a lot more believable, and they still found it important. Like, they don't need to hear kind of the most exaggerated or the highest possible.
Yeah, like 51% number. It's like people use that, and it's like, guys, I don't think that's like backed by any good peer review science. And yeah, if what you're saying is right, then it just seems like worsening our cause, not helping, right?
Totally, yeah, it destroys our credibility. And we don't need it to be 51% for it to matter. So using the lower end of the spectrum, the kind of non-exaggerated statistics seem to really help. And using a statistic did seem to really help. People seem to respond better when provided with some kind of number in a message.
Can I go back to the focus groups? I feel like I'm really fascinated by the sort of, like you say, just kind of everyday people discussing these topics in a group. I feel like even when it's like a group of vegans, right, there's so much disagreement, even between like who's the most vegan, or like, you know, who's doing the most, you know, the welfare argument, or, you know, so many different opposing views. And so I can imagine actually just finding those conversations so fascinating in terms of the different narratives that people are creating, or the different rationalizations that people make to, you know, justify their eating habits. Is there any kind of standout moments that you felt like surprised you or the team in terms of how those conversations played out? Or do you feel like it was like fairly typical, that there was a bit of back and forth and then a kind of resolute finish? Is there anything that particularly stood out for you?
Well, it's so interesting to think about it in comparison to a group of vegans, because, yeah, if we get a group of vegans together, we're going to have a lot of disagreement about a lot of things, because we've all thought about this issue a lot. But if you got, you know, those same 5 vegans in the room and you started asking us about like healthcare policy, and you presented a message, and then one person responded and said, "Oh, I think that's probably too much government overreach," or, you know, whatever they said. The rest of us might just kind of agree, because we haven't really thought about this issue very much. And we heard the first person, and, you know, give a compelling reason why that would or wouldn't work. And that's kind of how it went. There wasn't quite as much disagreement in the focus groups.
Interesting.
As you would expect in, say, a group of vegans. What was really interesting is how they liked the messengers. So we would display a picture of somebody who's talking, generally a human, sometimes an animal, and then kind of a quote from them, and then like a name and a title. And it was very interesting when they would like or dislike the messenger that we used. They'd often dislike the activists, the guy with the megaphone. They really disliked the rich people if we use like a celebrity, and if that person wasn't acknowledging cost and accessibility, then it came across as very sense that like, yeah, well, of course he can advocate for like veganism, like he has a private chef making all of his meals. Whereas if that person said, we need policies that make this more affordable and accessible. We need to make animal-free foods more accessible to more people, especially in food deserts. That seems to make a celebrity messenger a lot more credible and a lot more liked in general.
And so for context, so people so there's like a Zoom meeting with like 4 or 5 people, and you'll show like this like photoshopped image of some person with a quote saying, like, here's a message they're saying, and then you say like, what do you think of this message? Or like, they're advocating for this initiative, like, what do you think? Is that kind of how it's framed?
Yes, exactly. So we had this fictional initiative that we would tell them a little bit about the fictional initiative, which was different in different iterations of the focus groups. All of the messages that we showed were kind of ads that were advocating for the initiative. So they all said like, yes on 300 being our fictional initiative. Mm-hmm. And then the quotes sometimes would directly reference that. And so they would say, I think one messenger who did particularly well was the meat eating messenger, we call them. So if the quote said something like, I love eating meat, I've eaten meat all my life, I really enjoy a good steak every now and then, and I think Measure 300 is the best thing for our future, for our children, for the climate crisis, etc. That seemed to land really, really well, because it caused a lot less defensive-ness than this young activist with a megaphone kind of being better than you, right? It's somebody who's just like you, has kind of the cultural connection to eating animals that you do, and they're able to support this because it's the right thing. It kind of lets you know that you're not a hypocrite if you vote yes and aren't completely vegan.
How did the animal messaging go? I feel like maybe for me, I would assume that falls into the kind of maybe exaggerated box of like the stats, like, oh, this animal is saying like, please don't eat me or something. I feel like quite a lot of orgs like play into that sense of the individual animal and their voice. Do you feel like it had the same response as the exaggerated stats?
The animal messengers actually did really well. And the way that we tested animals was, in terms of like a quote from an animal, the way that we tested them was basically like very simple. We don't want to die. Picture of a couple pigs. Yes on 300. And that tended to go over really well, because it wasn't like a long drawn out quote where you were supposed to like engage your imagination very, very much to think that this animal is talking. But it was something that you could really imagine an animal communicating quite directly. So these animal messengers did pretty well. The animals were in these photos were happy, healthy animals who were on green grass and maybe baby pigs. We also tested some different images of animals alongside quotes from like slaughterhouse workers. And we found, I think what previous research and intuition would find is that the particularly gory images that caused quite a bit of defensiveness, that somebody would feel that they were being emotionally manipulated if they're shown like a really gory corpse alongside a quote that says yes on 300, like, okay, yeah, you're just trying to manipulate me and I don't want to be manipulated and I'm going to resist that. We also tried some images that were not so gory, but still pretty gross. So a particular image we tested was of chickens who were still on the slaughter line, had been defeathered. So they looked both like chickens, like birds, and also kind of like chicken that you would see at the grocery store. They looked like both. And that seems to bring up disgust and have people support the issue without that defensiveness, without that sense that you're trying to manipulate me. Because it's not a kind of during slaughter image. We call this like a post-slaughter image. So we had some success with both kind of the happy, healthy animals and that post-slaughter image. Yeah.
Wow. It's really fascinating. I think maybe this is kind of moving on, but how do you get organizations to use the research? It's so valuable, like the amount I feel like I've just learned in this short conversation. What are the plans to ask organizations and the people who work for them to listen to the research and put it into practice?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question. We're definitely having some great reception so far. Presenting at conferences wherever we can. We'll be speaking at the Animal Liberation Conference coming up in June in Berkeley, California. Very much looking forward to that. It's hosted by Direct Action Everywhere, DXE. And speaking to a lot of groups, having a lot of great reception. And the kind of main plan for this research is to put it into practice ourselves. So that instead of just, telling people what to do, we're leading by example, as they say, and putting it into practice ourselves and getting even, more evidence that if it's really strong messaging that held up in research, it should be strong messaging that kind of holds up in society and is effective at changing public opinion in these actual campaigns.
And it's all online, right? There's a really great website. It's hosted on your website. Maybe you can plug it. It's like narratives.paxfauna.org. Is that right?
Narrative.paxfauna.org. Yeah, definitely that's the place to see all the research. You can kind of see it summarized, and then if you really want to, you can read the full reports of everything that we did there.
And do you think it's applicable across different country contexts? How transferable do you think what you've learned is?
I imagine that some of it is quite transferable. There probably be parts that aren't quite so transferable. We only talk to Americans, to U.S. voters. One thing that came up a lot was like a concern for culture, for wanting to preserve not just like American culture, but this sense of, we call ourselves like a nation of immigrants, that if I came from somewhere else or my family's from somewhere else, or just like I have a concern for other people who have particular cultures that are important to them, there's a real need to be respectful of other cultures. And, when kind of white Americans would talk about culture, they would call it tradition. And when anyone would talk about kind of non-white American cultures, they would call it culture. But I think the need for in both is the same, is like having a lot of empathy for having somebody say, yes, it doesn't taste the same. The new plant-based alternatives don't taste exactly the same as meat.
Yeah.
And cultures are changing in big ways all the time. And we need to go forward for kind of our own very existence and to be compassionate towards animals. And so I imagine that piece can be very transferable, because it is effective both for tradition, both for people who identify with like a dominant culture and with non-dominant cultures. Though, we did only test these messages in the US. So it would be very interesting to run similar studies in other places.
On the actual message, I think you kind of hinted at it maybe previously, but I didn't actually ask. But so did you test just like all kind of animal-focused kind of like appeals or asks, or you also mentioned some climate-focused ones? And do you have a sense of which one of those works better, or how much did you test like what's like health-related stuff versus animal welfare versus climate, etc.?
When we were doing the research, our question wasn't so much which subject matter lands best, but sort of how do we frame these subject matters and do they conflict with each other? What we found is that a lot of times the health-focused messages would feel like they were conflicting. It would feel like, wait, you said this was about animals earlier, and now you're talking about health. Like, I think this is just some paid doctor who's trying to, somebody just paid this guy to like say something so that we would think that it was healthy. The climate and animal messages didn't seem to have that effect, that people were able to kind of hear a real animal rights, animal welfare focused message, and also hear a climate or kind of environmental justice focused message, and not bring up any like conflicts, not saying like, wait, you're saying that we're polluting waterways, but earlier you said it was about animal rights. That kind of conflict didn't really come up. Health also, it's another subject along with food that can really bring up the personal autonomy frame, where
so loaded, right?
Yeah, very loaded. And people can really think about health as something that's like, regardless of how many systemic factors affect our health, people really think about it as a matter of your personal choice and your personal habits. And if you're obese or something, that they often think that that's kind of like your fault. The health messages are definitely harder to kind of get to be in resonance with a more systemic frame, where both climate and animal focused messages seem to be a lot easier to frame in that way.
And then in terms of your future work, well, because you said you want to implement some of this stuff into practice, and I think we spoke before about the ballot initiatives. So maybe do you want to touch on, so if I get this right, the plan is you're going to run 2 ballot initiatives in Denver, Colorado next year. And then what are the topics of those? So I think one's a ban on slaughterhouses and the other one was...
Yeah, so ban on slaughterhouses, and then we're planning also maybe a fur ban at the same time.
Okay, cool.
And one reason for kind of doing both of those is that a ban on slaughterhouses, it can very easily have some messaging or thinking around it that it's not about animals, that it's more of like a not in my backyard. I don't want this kind of polluting, like ugly thing in my city. Whereas a ban on fur can feel like it's only about specific animals. We hope that running both of these at once will lead to a conversation that's a little bit more robust, because the kind of animals, like the injustice of killing is sort of the thread that ties them both together. So planning to do both of those on the 2024 election, really, really put a lot of work into gathering what we learn and making it available for the rest of the movement. It's a huge priority of Pax Fauna to make everything we learn in the course of our work into really, really accessible resources that anybody can use to, do similar work or apply to the work that they're already doing. In the future, we'd love to be able to do this same thing, maybe the same policies, maybe other policies in more cities and maybe even the state level in the US.
And you pick those 2 policies. I didn't quite realize that. That's quite cool and something. So one's almost like point of production work and one's almost like point of consumption. So it's interesting having these 2 different angles of like, yeah, you can test different messages and there's this thread tying them together. And then is there other reasons why you picked these 2 particular ones, was just like how winnable they are? And I guess you want to start with maybe some wins and something that's not too difficult. Although the Oregon one, you guys aren't doing that, but that one sounds extremely difficult. But yeah, was like how easy it is to win a factor in your decision?
Yes, absolutely. We wanted something that probably would have like a 50% chance of winning, something that's like, it's winnable. It's not definitely going to win. And that's kind of where we landed on the slaughterhouse ban. The fur ban, I expect to be a lot easier to win, because we've seen that happen in other jurisdictions. Fred Johannes, who just joined our team, kind of led the fur ban in Boulder, Colorado, very close by to Denver, Colorado. And that won with no campaigning and maybe even some negative campaigning.
What was like the percentage, like yes versus no?
It was like a 600 vote difference. It was very, very close. But it won without a campaign. They got it on the ballot and it did almost nothing else. There was even a problem with the law it was very fixable afterwards by city council, but that ended up having some animal advocates say, actually vote no on this because it might cause problems later down the road. So it was actually like something that we not only didn't campaign for, but was kind of campaigned against by the movement. And wow. I think that it speaks to how popular our fur ban is, that it won even with that in mind. And the problem with the law was fixed immediately afterwards. So it was all good.
What was the problem? I'm really curious now what it was.
It was very specific. It was something about how there was a state preemption problem where in the state constitution, you were allowed to hunt, allowed to sell the bodies of animals that you hunt. And that's a pelt is fur. And then there's this problem in the law where it should say fur and fur products, because a fur product is anything made out of that. And so you're allowed to ban the fur product, but not the fur. And so there was this one place in the law where it didn't say fur and fur products, or it should have said one or the other. And so it could have had a problem. But that was very easily fixed by the city council after the passing of the law.
Nice.
Yeah, so there are all these little things you got to think about, all these little details that the lawyers got to catch. And
are you working with lawyers now to draft your ones for the slaughterhouse ban? Like, has something like that been passed before in the US?
There are some slaughterhouse bans, small handful. And yeah, we're working with lawyers to figure out how to make a really strong law. We don't yet have like the actual language. It's definitely something that matters a lot because something will certainly be challenged in court, and we would like that to not be struck down in court. So that's definitely a big part of the work.
How's the research that you conducted affected your communication strategy for this ballot? You obviously chosen slaughter, which, as you know from the research, those kind of slaughter images, the particularly graphic ones, aren't so useful and convincing. How do you feel like it's practically, I love that you're saying, as an organization, you're putting the research into practice. So how has that impacted the way that you're running this particular campaign?
Well, the research is definitely still ongoing. We have some ideas about what will work better because we did all this research, and we want to run some studies on the actual messages that we want to test. Like I mentioned, we tested these kind of half gory images, right? The kind of disgusting images of a bird who's just post slaughter. I want to test some messages around like kind of sad images, like a picture of a lamb who is in a slaughter truck. Not quite gory, but not something we've tested before. So it's definitely important to us that our messages kind of, it's not just extrapolation, but that we're doing as much as we can kind of afford to run some surveys on the messages and test, not just like, do people like it, but do people who see that message report a stronger support for animal issues in general and a stronger support for our policy in particular when they see that message, as opposed to people who see a different one.
In terms of the movement adopting the research, to what extent is it useful for, say, most organizations pivot and we stop using the gory imagery and we're using the evidence from the research to shift the way that we're communicating with the public? Do you think there's a threshold, say we all move to that kind of messaging and communication strategy? Do we lose out on some diversification? Are we losing out on some people who maybe would respond to the more graphic imagery? Is it kind of from the research a sense that the majority of people should move towards these findings? Or do you think there is benefit in keep testing kind of the different messages and where they might have success?
Well, anecdotally, we definitely know ourselves, and we know people who have gotten involved in the movement, and we've gotten involved in all different ways. And so if I could definitely see there being a value to diversity, and I definitely can't see a world where the movement isn't still using some of that messages. So I do think that the majority of the movement moving towards a system frame when talking about the issue would be a very positive thing, because that's kind of how we can cause system-wide interventions, and that's how we can sort of make that really, really strong cultural force that tells us that we need to keep eating animals in order to still have belonging, to still have like really important needs met.
Right.
If we can weaken that through policy and through kind of acting together as a society, which is what the government exists to do, then I think that will be a huge positive.
Amazing. It's I'm just so grateful that you exist, right? The fact that this research exists, the fact that we're moving forward as a movement, we're progressing. It's no longer the kind of previous, maybe more like amateur version of ourselves. It's like a professional movement now. There's more money coming in. Like we need to have research like this to make sure we're evolving in the right direction towards, the end of factory farming, the end of animal consumption, whatever it is the theory of changes are, progressing on that path. Yeah, I think it's just very interesting. I feel like I've learned a lot in this episode already.
Let's say 2024 comes, you guys win both ballot initiatives, because of course you guys will. You'll do amazing work, no doubt about it. What's the plan for after that? I think you have plans to scale, or is repeat it, or what happens after 2024?
Yeah, definitely want to scale. It would be great to be running a statewide.
In Colorado or somewhere else?
Colorado would be a likely place, since that's kind of where we're doing the capacity building right now. It would also be great to get some organizers in other cities to be doing some of the same stuff. And those cities are kind of we're still thinking about which cities would be interesting, would be best to work with. And there are a bunch of kind of criteria we have in our minds about what types of cities would be good. We have some that we're thinking of, and it's very undetermined right now kind of where we would move after Denver.
But you would still use the same two initiatives, fur farming and banning fur and ending slaughterhouse? So would you kind of try branch out and try different stuff as well?
Definitely interested in trying other stuff as well. I'm sure that, a slaughterhouse ban in Denver makes a particular kind of sense because there is one slaughterhouse in Denver. A city with no slaughterhouses it's going to be very different to run a slaughter ban. Maybe a lot more achievable, maybe a lot less inspiring to activists who want to see actual change happen from the work that they're doing. Yeah, the policy is definitely not married to the policies. The policies kind of make sense in this particular context. And we plan to do a lot more research on policies in the coming years before kind of the time comes to propose some others. What I would love to see is kind of a menu of different kind of model legislation that different cities can use in a way that makes sense for their activist communities and for their actual city and kind of culture of that city.
And when you think about these policies, how much are you trying to optimize for big impact for animals now versus galvanizing the movement versus achievable? What are the kind of things you're trading off and how much weight you put on them?
Yeah, those are all trade-offs. I think a perfect policy would have a significant impact for animals now. I think that's really important because we never know what tomorrow brings. We want our actions to have real impact soon. And that's also really important for inspiring activists, right? We can't all kind of have this really long-term view of the movement and always feel really motivated by okay, if I gather signatures today, then that means that in 20 years, we might have a nationwide slaughter ban. It's really hard to kind of feel motivation in that way. And so having a kind of more immediate result is really important for that reason also. We want things that are winnable, but not too winnable, because we really want to be pushing the envelope as much as we can. And having the cultural change be as fast as possible because it's an emergency. And the possibility to really affect public opinion, that if someone actually interacts with this message, with this idea, that they come out of that conversation more supportive of animal issues in general, and thus animal issues are just more politicized in general, that people kind of consider it an actual political issue and not just kind of a fringe hobby that some people have.
Very cool. Very exciting. Maybe just very briefly on statewide versus citywide stuff. How different or how much harder is it to run a statewide ballot initiative versus a citywide?
A lot. Gosh, I wish I had the numbers right in front of me, but we're talking about many, many more signatures are needed for a statewide initiative.
How many is needed for a citywide one to get on the ballot initially?
I want to say somewhere around 20,000 for the city of Denver. It's going to be different for every city. It's usually a percentage of the population or a percentage of the voter turnout from the last election that needs to sign a petition in order for it to get on the ballot. And so, of course, that's going to be a lot larger in the state of Colorado than it is in the city of Denver. We really want to build a really strong volunteer apparatus that's able to scale and able to inspire a lot of people throughout the state to be ready to do something a whole lot bigger in the next election.
I remember speaking to Aidan, who's your co-founder. I think it was 10 million ballpark budget required for a statewide ballot initiative. I don't know how accurate that is, but it seemed pretty big. Much bigger than the citywide ones. Yeah,
it definitely depends on what kind of volunteer apparatus you are doing. And so, our budget, our hoped for budget for even for a volunteer initiative, because we really want to build a really strong volunteer apparatus that can scale, is bigger than it would be if we were just hiring people to gather the signatures. If you just wanted to kind of throw money at something and get something on the ballot, that could cost a whole lot less than having a lot of people really putting a lot of thought into mobilizing volunteers and getting kind of a true grassroots support for something. And so the price of the statewide initiative is really going to depend on how many people are inspired to put their time in to make it happen.
Okay, perfect. Well, we end the podcast with some just kind of quick fire questions. What's a view you hold that most animal advocates would disagree with?
I alluded to it earlier, but I'll say it kind of more directly now. I don't think it is useful for the movement for our ask to be go vegan. I don't think that giving people information about veganism is the way forward. My personal practice of veganism is very important to me, and I will never not practice it. And when we're engaging with the public, we have to have political asks. We have to have asks that tell them that they're a member of a society and they have certain responsibilities in that way, not that they're a consumer who's supposed to shop better than other people.
What do you wish more people were working on? I guess maybe that's also pretty self-explanatory. More research to support the movement generally.
I love research. One thing I'm really excited about that other people are doing is kind of these default veg programs, these campaigns to get institutions to go vegan, which I feel very differently about than kind of the personal veganism requests. Because if you go to a hospital or you go to a school and there's no meat there, that sells you an idea that this is normal, that like society is moving away. Society is evolving away from using animals for food. A development in New York City where the hospitals are offering vegan food as the default option if you're going to be fed in New York City hospital. I think that is huge, and that's very powerful. We need to have institutions that are telling the story, and that's kind of where we go, and things feel so normal. If they exist in a hospital, they feel very normal.
And what's an animal-related view you think you changed your mind on recently?
I think early in the movement, I was very anti-welfare campaigns. I thought that they were really selling ourselves short and that they were actively harmful because they would make more people feel better about eating animals, that they would support the humane myth and have people think, oh, no, well, California banned cages, so my eggs are coming from happy chickens. For one, I don't actually think there's any evidence of that. I don't think that there's any evidence that we have that people who live in places that just passed a welfare thing, there's no evidence that they are more resistant to animal policies in the future. In fact, I think that these campaigns probably have a lot of value in terms of building institutional power for the animal rights movement. I don't think that they aren't asks that Pax Fauna is ever going to work on, because they don't really tell the story that society is moving away from using animals for food. And that's really the story that we want to tell. But the fact that other people are doing them and other people are building institutional power for the animal rights movement, are building relationships with legislatures and doing really, really important work in that regard, I think that makes me happy that they exist. And that's a huge change from where I lived a few years ago.
I think Aidan, I think I've mentioned it before on the podcast, got this great blog called, I think it's Welfareism versus Abolition is Obsolete. And I think, recommend that. That's on your website in the blog areas. I would definitely recommend that. It's a great read.
Maybe one bit of news that you're excited about or grateful for recently?
The acquittal of Wayne Chung and Paul Darwin Picklesheimer in Utah this past fall was huge. This was a jury in a very conservative area who unanimously said that these men who openly rescued animals and told the truth about it in court, who completely admitted to it, that they did the right thing. I think that is just such an inspiring message for our community. I was lucky enough to be there even in the courtroom when the decision came down, and it's probably the most kind of inspiring moment that I've had in quite a long time. I'm so happy to see this kind of thing happening. It definitely sets a cultural precedent, if not a legal one. And I'm really excited to see more of that and to just see ordinary people saying that, yes, rescue is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
I had goosebumps just you talking about it. That's so exciting.
I did. Yeah. Like when all my legs, I was like, oh, wow.
That's very cool. That's super, super cool. Yeah, I think that was also probably, I think I may mention that as one of the most inspiring things I've seen recently as well. I think, and the fact that happened again. So just like, I was actually in California 2 weeks ago, and when the Foster Farms trial again ended, and again they were acquitted, and so it's 2 in a row is like no longer a coincidence, right? This is like maybe the start of a pattern. So it's quite exciting. Yeah. So hopefully yours is the next in this chain.
3 for 3.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess speaking of 3, in terms of some media recommendations for people who want to either hear about your work or like things you found interesting or like would recommend, or it could be books, blogs, podcasts, or like pieces of content you think kind of like highlight some important things that you want to share around.
So the first one I'll mention is something that is very related to this conversation, Change by Damien Centola. It's a book about kind of social networks and why people change. And his discussion of social norms and kind of the virality of the way that our social norms can spread adds this really realistic angle to the conversations in the movement. If we're talking about veganism, I think that there can be so much frustration around, anything that involves an individual ask, there can be so much frustration with people not doing it. either like, why aren't people voting the way that we want them to? Why aren't people going vegan? Why aren't people joining the thing that I'm trying to organize, where I'm trying to get people to come out to protest, and all these people are not coming out to protest? What's wrong? I think this book, Change, really adds this kind of realistic angle about like, well, okay, why do people actually change, and why do people change big behavioral things, which can be like, are you coming out to protests, or are you voting a particular way, or are you really changing your ideology in a big way? That talk of social networks is, I think, super important, and I recommend that book to kind of anybody who's interested in this stuff. Another book that kind of spoke to me recently is maybe more in the kind of pop science genre, but Stolen Focus: Why You Can't Pay Attention, How to Think Deeply Again. That's Johann Hari. And in some ways, it's kind of another book about how smartphones are ruining our ability to pay attention. And I think it's probably healthy for us to interact with this kind of content every so often, kind of reevaluate the role that technology plays in our lives. But the thing that I find particularly interesting about this one is that it destroys the individual kind of consumer personal responsibility frame of the problem. Whereas I think other content I've interacted with around this genre, this subject rather, kind of tells you that you need to have a better relationship with your phone because it's ruining your life and you got to be more disciplined. Whereas this one really flips that on its head and uses a systemic lens, advocate for policies that would fix the problem, something like regulating Facebook like a public utility, making sure the social algorithms are there to increase happiness, increase well-being, and increase social connections instead of just like to keep us on the apps. And this is the kind of reframe that I really want to see in animal advocacy. And so to read it in this unrelated field and see just like, yeah, you really got to repeat it a whole bunch of times because people aren't going to get it unless you're like really, really repeating it a bunch of times and saying, yeah, there's this advice out there. And like, yeah, I love this app that controls the way I use my smartphone. And that's not a complete solution. You can be a super disciplined person, and that's not a complete solution to this problem. What we need is systemic change, and to hear how much it really takes to like actually execute that reframe. I found super useful. And then the third I'll mention, oldie but a goodie, Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. NVC is a modality that exists to really increase connection between people by minimizing like blame and right-wrong thinking, and presents this like method of this practice of empathy with anybody. And for me, nonviolent communication is a lifelong practice. It's something that I dedicate really a lot of time to studying and sharing. And I think reading the book is a really great start for anybody who wants to communicate across really big differences, and which is anybody who's doing movement work. I mean, we're talking to people who have behaviors that we really, really don't like, and to have a way to communicate with those people with empathy, I think is just really existential to our work.
Very cool. Those are great recommendations. Actually, I haven't even read that Damon Centola book, so I'm definitely going to buy Change and I'm going to read it. So thanks for the nudge and for the reminder. How can people find out more about you and your work and Pax Fauna?
So our website is paxfauna.org. On there, you can read about our narrative recommendations. You can read our blogs. And we also have a lot of volunteer opportunities. People can, if people want to volunteer, on a variety of different ways. There are a lot of different ways people can help. We are also hiring a couple of people in Denver, Colorado. So if you know anyone there, definitely appreciate spreading the word on that. Of course, also ways to financially support if that's a meaningful way to contribute for people. So that's all at paxfauna.org.
Nice.
Perfect.
Well, thanks so much for coming on, Eva. It's been super interesting. I feel like, learned a lot and covered lots of interesting topics. So thanks so much for your work and thanks for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. So much enjoyed talking to both of you.